It's Saturday, February 10th, 2024. I'm Pastor Paul, and this is week 6 of our weekly Bible Insights. Well, here we are in Matthew, finishing out Matthew for this week and starting into Mark. And so we're going to take a look here at Matthew chapter 26, because here we are getting into the Passion Week of Christ as we went through last week. And I hope that helped you for your reading this week a great deal. But there are some things that I would like to point out. And so this may not be the longest of podcasts, but that's okay too. We'll catch up another week, I'm sure. And so here in Matthew chapter 26, we have the Passover. And so Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples. And this is a monumental time. Why? Because here we have Judas going to betray Jesus. And we have that there at the very beginning of Matthew, starting there in verse 20. Now, when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with his 12 disciples. And what does that? He's not in a recliner. You know, these tables are Middle Eastern in a sense. So, well, they are. And so they're down low. Everybody's sitting around the outside of the table so that they could all see each other. And there's an opening in the middle so that servants could come in and put food before the people. And so they're all reclining on their probably left arm at the table side by side. And it says there, as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me." Being deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, "Surely not I, Lord." And he answered, "He who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who betrayed me. The Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." And Judas, who was betraying him, said, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." Rabbi meaning teacher. And Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself." And we have from the synoptic, so Matthew, Mark, Luke are synoptic gospels, and we're going to obviously get into Matthew here very shortly, but here in Matthew, I want you to pay attention to something, and you're going to see it later on. Was Judas in the upper room for the Passover and the teaching of Jesus? Partially, yes, but really not for the teaching of Jesus, because after this happened and he started teaching his disciples, Judas was gone. Judas left. And so, very interesting time. And he gets into the betrayal there, and Judas goes and does what he's going to do. And so moving on there, and that's just a fascinating fact there of the upper room discourse that is talking to his disciples about, and Judas's betrayal of Jesus. And so we have Jesus kind of on trial there. Again, this is that just night before his actual crucifixion. And so this is really his Thursday night. And that night, Judas goes to the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin then comes out after the Lord's Supper is initiated by Jesus in the upper room with his disciples after the Passover feast. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's here in this garden that the Sanhedrin come, and they, with a Roman escort, of most likely a great number of Roman guards, because remember, this was an uprising. This was a person who was said to be dangerous, and so no doubt the Sanhedrin's coming, but they're not in authority really to arrest. Rather, the Romans are, and the Romans are coming with a great deal of Roman soldiers to arrest Jesus. And so that's really what we're seeing here take place. And so we have this whole kind of narrative of what took place there in verse 36. Jesus came with his disciples to the place called Gethsemane, and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And they were, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here, keep watch." And so we have this whole discourse taking place, and the disciples are tired. They're worn out. It's been a busy week, and they're tired and they're sleeping. While he was still speaking, it says there in verse 47 of chapter 26 of Matthew, "Behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up and accompanied by a large crowd." Okay, this is that crowd of the Sanhedrin coming out with swords and clubs. The Roman soldiers as well is really what we're talked about here. And I want you to kind of put yourself in the position of these Roman soldiers. Here's this uprising, this man who is leading a major uprising. They were most likely scared, okay? They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know who to expect. And so they're coming out ready with ultimate force. And they know that this could be their last night on earth, okay? They're ready to throw it down, so to speak. And it says here in verse 48, "Now he who was betraying him gave him a kiss, which was the sign, saying, 'Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him.' And immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, 'Hail, Rabbi,' and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, 'Friend, do what you have come for.' Then they came, they laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. And behold, one of them who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest to cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword back in its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you not know that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that this must happen this way?' And it says here, at that time Jesus said to the crowds, 'Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. It says there in verse 56, but all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets." Now, this is very interesting. And again, in the synoptics, we actually see the soldiers laughing, falling down over themselves, just laughing at what is actually taking place. Why? They are relieved. This is the person that we have come out to get. And he's not going with a fight. There's no army behind him. There's no horde of people wailing and ready to fight for him. No, it's just him and his disciples. And he's speaking peace. Not only is he speaking peace, he's causing peace to take place. Here is Peter cutting off this guy's ear, the servant of the high priest, and Jesus makes him perfectly well again. And so we'll see that also in Mark. But then we have the hearings, and we have the hearing before the high priest. That takes place there in the end of verse 26. And this is when, of course, Jesus talks to Peter and says, "Hey, you know what? You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." And sure enough, he did. Chapter 27, we see him before the Sanhedrin and Pilate then in verse 27, verses 11 through 26. And, this is just the period of time before the trials. And there's 6 of them in particular. You have the first one in the nighttime hours before Annas, the high priest. And then we have a second and primary trial before the Sanhedrin that occurs here in chapter 27. And then a third trial immediately at dawn. So as the sun's rising. And this is when Peter denies Jesus the 3rd time, and Jesus looked upon him. Can you imagine what he felt when that took place? And then Jesus taken to the Romans, and the 4th trial is actually before Pilate. And Pilate really wanted to meet Jesus, and he's looking for a sign. He heard all about the miracles that Jesus had been doing, and he's looking for Jesus to do a miracle. He's asking for him to, and Jesus gives him no sign, gives him no wonders, really gives him nothing. And Pilate finds no fault in Jesus whatsoever. Okay, it's not as if everybody he went before found fault in Jesus. No, that's not the case at all. Pilate washed his hands of his death before the people, and but that was only the fourth trial. The fifth trial was before Herod, and this is not Herod the Great, mind you. He is already passed from the scene. He is dead. This is one of his sons there, and he's looking for a miracle as well. And then his sixth and last trial was before Pilate. And this is when the city cries out after the scribes and the Pharisees and Sadducees yell, "Crucify him!" And he's condemned to death. And they release Barabbas, a killer, murderer, and they keep the sinless Son of God, and they crucify him. And so we have that here laid out for us, and that's really covering chapter 27 and chapter, there we have the sayings of Jesus upon the cross, and there were 3 done before noon. Okay, so if you remember, his arrest took place, we'll say Thursday night at probably 10, 11 o'clock at night, and his trial started probably around midnight or shortly thereafter on Friday morning. And all those took place rather quickly in the early wee hours of the morning before the crowds really got up. But by the time he's at his 6th trial, the crowds are already gathered. And the Pharisees, Sadducees have already, in a sense, condemned him to death. And the crowds are following their lead because they are their leaders. And so Jesus is on the cross there. And on Friday before noon, at least a couple hours before noon, and there's 7 sayings. He says, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Today, he looks at the thief on the cross next to him. "You will be with me in paradise." And then he talks to his mother and John. He says, "Woman, behold your son." He's passing off his right and responsibility as the oldest son. And because none of his siblings were there at the foot of the cross, he actually puts his mother's trust into the hands of John, the beloved, as we see in the Gospel of John. And then we have noon take place, and darkness falls over the earth until 3 p.m. Okay, and so you can imagine he's been on the cross now for a few hours. And after darkness ends, he is then recorded to say, my God, why have thou forsaken me?" He says this in his native Aramaic tongue. "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? And after that, he says, "I thirst," again, fulfilling prophecy. And then he says, "It is finished." The payment of the sins of the world have been paid. And then he says, into thy hands I commit my spirit," and he breathes willingly his last breath. And so we have there at that time, about 3 p.m., the veil is torn, rocks are bent and rent. We read here of a small earthquake locally. Some of the graves are open and people come back to life. I hope you realize that. And they're going up into the city, these people. How crazy. If your loved one had been dead for a few years and all of a sudden here they are. I mean, what would you think? All right. And Jesus' side is then pierced by the guard, and we see blood and water come out separate, and that showed and still is a showing of death. And then he's taken down, and he's actually placed in his burial tomb by midnight. Or not midnight, but by sundown, I should say. By sundown. And so these are all things that took place there on Friday. And that's really where it's bringing, not a close, so to speak, because Matthew goes on further and talks about the burial. And then chapter 28, we have very briefly, now after the Sabbath, it began to dawn the first day of the week. That's Sunday. And we have the resurrection of Jesus from the grave. And this is when he goes ahead of his disciples and to Galilee. And he tells them there the Great Commission. And this is even for us, our commissioning as well. All authority has been given to me, Jesus says, in heaven and on earth. Go therefore, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I remember in my undergrad in Bible college, that was one of the first sections here, the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 19, and 20, that we had to memorize. And it is wonderful. It is something we should all memorize and keep in our hearts because it's for us as well. And then we get to Mark chapter 1. We see a little bit different shift in Mark. Mark kind of goes directly into the service of Jesus. Okay. And he doesn't talk about his background, doesn't really give a genealogy like Matthew and Luke do, but instead he goes straight into the ministry of John the Baptist, and then the baptism of Jesus, and then his temptation and his start of his ministry. And that's really what we're seeing here in Mark chapter 1 and chapter 2. And so we're not going to say too much into this this week, but I want you to continue reading and realizing that Mark jumps right in and starts the timeline of Jesus's ministry. And so by the time we're reading here, Jesus is already, 30 years old and starting his ministry after the baptism of himself, or after his baptism by John the Baptist, and then his temptation in the wilderness. He began to preach. And so keep that in your hearts, keep that in your minds. I hope this is helpful, and I hope this makes some clarification as to what you're reading and what took place and when. And we're going to dig deeper into Mark here in the week or next week. But I want to just leave you with this now because we are pushing our time limit of 20 minutes or so that I'd like to keep these under. But I just want to thank you guys for all of your questions. I hope I'm answering them for you in a timely manner. And if you do have any more questions, please send in your questions to lighthousebaptistva.com or send an email directly to me at pastorpaul@lighthousebaptistva.com. I'll meet you again next week for our weekly Bible Insights.